Sometimes a tragedy is so unimaginable and devastating that it lasts forever and becomes almost a dark legend. But this tragedy isn't a legend. It's a true story of 6 Boy Scouts who, after making plans at a scout meeting earlier in the week to hike to Mount Baldy in the Santa Rita Mountains south of Tucson for 2 of the boys' birthdays, headed off on November 15, 1958, in beautiful weather, and within 6 hours were in a fight for their lives. On the 67th anniversary of this event, Ralph Coltrin, one of the 6 scouts, took us on a hike into this story to show us what happened that day, making sure that this terrible event and the boys who endured it are never forgotten.
They didn't realize how far away they were, really. That's, like say 5 o'clock and the clouds are there and it's getting dark. I think they probably turned around about the same time that Lou Burgess left. I don't think they ever even got to Baldy Saddle.
It started on a clear, red sky morning when the 6 scouts between the ages of 11 and 16 from Troop 70 in Tucson packed up what they needed to camp that night, and Mike Early's dad drove them to Madera Canyon. He dropped them off at the Santa Rita Lodge at about noon, and they walked up the road a final mile to a picnic and camping area. They set up camp.
That was the difference between living and dying. We stayed dry.
Ate their lunch, and at 1:15, Mike Early blew his whistle to announce their start up the trail. The hike to the peak is 10 miles round trip and 4,000 feet of elevation gain. It's a tough hike that takes many hikers 7 to 8 hours, and none of the boys had hiked all the way to the peak before. On our group's hike, we saw plenty of other hikers, including some who, like us, were hiking to remember the Scouts' hike.
So he realized that it fell on the side, so that's why we headed
But
up.
on that day in 1958, the 6 boys saw no other hikers on the Old Baldy Trail. The boys made it the 2.5 miles to Josephine Saddle in about 2 hours and took a break.
How many people do you think you've brought up here over the years?
Yeah, probably gets into thousands.
After the saddle, they continued on slowly, taking breaks for maybe another mile until Ronnie, the 11-year-old, was completely exhausted. His feet were blistered, and he couldn't go any farther. Remember, the boys had also walked a mile from the Santa Rita Lodge to their campsite. The 5 boys decided Ronnie would wait where he was while the others continued on. But almost immediately, Lou, the oldest, wisely decided that leaving him alone was a bad idea, and that Ralph should stay with Ronnie for safety. Ralph was disappointed, but agreed to stay. Lou said he'd be back in a half hour. The 4 scouts continued on, but it wasn't long until they needed to rest yet again. After that, Lou made another crucial decision. Knowing that he had promised Ralph and Ronnie that he'd be back in a half hour, Lou turned back. He tried to convince the other 3, but they were determined to make it to the peak, and he turned back alone. They had one flashlight between them, and when they finally reached their campsite in the cold and pitch black, they had hiked about 7 miles in more than 6 hours. They hoped the other 3 scouts would be back in camp soon. But it went from bad to worse at the campsite for Lou, Ralph, and Ronnie, and from bad to disastrous for Mike, Michael, and David, who were still on the mountain. For the scouts at the campsite, they got into their shelters and had the longest and most frightening night of their lives. The weather worsened, and with temperatures dropping, it began to rain and, soon enough, to snow. Lou and Ronnie's tents collapsed. After a short stint trying to stay dry in the stinky, freezing outhouse, they huddled together with Ralph under the shelter he had set up beneath a concrete picnic table to survive the night. By the next morning, the other 3 scouts still hadn't arrived. Someone who did arrive in the morning, though, was John Early, Mike Early's dad, who arrived just as Ronnie, who was shoeless by this time, and Ralph ran a mile through 2 feet of snow down towards the Santa Rita Lodge. And the largest search in Arizona history for missing persons began. First, a ham radio operator at the lodge sent a message to another operator in Kansas, who routed it to Tucson, which resulted in the alarm being raised. What took place next is described movingly in Cathy Hufault's book. She's Ralph's sister, and like all the family members and many others, was deeply affected by the tragedy. The search started and included sheriff's posse members, ranchers who searched on horseback through snowdrifts up to 7 feet high, ski club members who flattened snow with their skis to make walking through the snow easier, scouts from other local troops, soldiers from Fort Huachuca who hiked through canyon after canyon, and bloodhounds, and pilots who flew helicopters and planes over the ranges, mountains, and canyons. Lou Burgess and the fathers of the missing boys searched too. There were over 700 volunteers on some days, and they all came to help find the boys. Finally, on December 4th, after 19 days of searching, came 2 gunshots. These shots were the signal that the boys had been found. The boys were found in a gully in Temporal Canyon. The best that can be determined is that they turned around somewhere near Baldy Saddle, and as they hiked down the Old Baldy trail in the dark and cold, with only one flashlight between them, instead of continuing north at Josephine Saddle back to their campsite, they accidentally veered south onto the Temporal Canyon Trail.
So you can imagine coming down in the dark, it was real easy to go that way as opposed to this way.
A mile down the wrong trail, Mike Early broke his leg, maybe from tripping over an old telephone wire on the ground. Oh my gosh. Oh. And then the 3 boys slid off the trail into a gully.
And going down?
They built a small fire to stay warm, but soon the freezing rain started, and as it got colder, the snow started falling. And the boys in their thin cotton clothes had no chance of surviving the 5 to 7 feet of snow that fell that night. It's almost inconceivable that the simple act of turning around a half hour later changed the outcome for these 3 boys. But it did. Everything went wrong, and this tragedy was the result. In the aftermath of the deaths, the troop leader quickly denied that he had okayed the hike, even though the boys had planned it at previous scout meetings. Ralph lived with guilt.
You know, I remember one of the talks I was giving, and somebody asked about survivor's guilt, and I thought, that's what that is. So why them and not me?
Finally, at a commemoration event in 2008, Boy Scout leaders assured him that the hike was indeed a sanctioned event, and that the Troop 70 leader should have been with the Scouts.
I've been running east, looking for a sunset, digging deep since '99. What I thought was gone was sitting in my pocket in plain sight all along. I think it's time for me to go, burn all bridges. All I know, I got lost along the way, fell between the foam, pulling stitches. Time to let go, so come what may. Don't look before you leave. What you give, you get to keep. So long, farewell, bye-bye. Let's have a toast for those lost old lives. my crooked